All bubbles are not created equal. Hi, my name's Emily, and today I wanted to talk about some of the differences between the sparkling wines that are available on the market today. I think we all think about sparkling wine as like a celebratory thing, and most of our minds are going to go immediately to champagne because it's one of the most popular, most well-known varieties of sparkling wine out there. We all probably have realized at this point that there's also a pretty hefty price tag attached to champagne, which is part of the thing that makes it feel very celebratory. But me personally, I love champagne or sparkling wine just as an everyday kind of beverage as well. I think it's really light flavored and it just tastes really good to me, especially when it's hot out. It adds a little bit of a refreshing twist to your typical white wine. So what I wanted to talk today about is what makes some of the different sparkling wine varieties different, and help you figure out what can give you some of the same characteristics that everybody loves in champagne without that crazy price tag. So first and foremost, when it comes to sparkling wine, there are two different methods that you can use to achieve the carbonated feel that comes with sparkling wine. The first one is the méthode traditionnelle, the traditional method, wherein the secondary fermentation takes place in the bottle. And what do I mean by that? So all wine, whether it's sparkling or not, red or white, whatever, has to go through a fermentation process in order for alcohol to be created. So that just means that winemakers are adding yeast cells or yeast to the wine so that it reacts with the sugar and creates alcohol. Now, for most wine, that's where the process stops. But if you want to add a sparkling characteristic to it, get some bubbles in there, then you have to do a secondary fermentation, which means that once the alcohol is created, you add additional yeast cells so that rather than producing alcohol, they're creating CO2. So in the traditional method, that secondary fermentation happens inside of each individual bottle. So they add the wine that's been created into the bottle and then add additional yeast cells there, and then it's aged usually for quite a long time. And when the wine is in contact with those yeast cells, it's giving it like a breadier, toastier, nuttier flavor. But this also means, because it's happening in each individual bottle, it's going to be more expensive and time consuming. And so that's why typically you're going to see like a champagne versus a Prosecco, you see a much heftier price tag. So the other alternative to doing a traditional method, secondary fermentation, is the Crémant method, which is essentially the second fermentation just takes place all in one big tank. So rather than doing a secondary fermentation in the bottle, they add the additional yeast cells directly to the tank where the original fermentation was happening. So what does this mean? Like, what's the really big differences between the two? A traditional method is going to leave you with much more like persistent, smaller bubbles. And it gives, again, that like nuttier flavor. Whereas the Crémant method leaves much bigger bubbles because the wine is more spread out. It's not quite so condensed. And then it's typically going to be like a fruitier flavor because the wine itself is not in contact with those dead yeast cells. We call that aging on the lees, which lees really just means yeast cells. And so it's that contact that gives it that bready flavor. So let's talk about some of the different wine varieties. We'll start with champagne because everybody knows that one. So this is considered like the king of sparkling wines. And really what makes it so expensive is the history and the tradition and the fact that a lot of really strict regulations have to be met in order for it to be considered champagne. So like I said, it has to be the traditional method. It has to be within the region of Champagne. It has to be 3 very specific types of grape. It can be Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, or Pinot Meunier. And essentially it's giving it much more of a like layered feel than just a typical like Prosecco will. So there's a couple different options too. So you can, if you read on a wine label that it says Blanc de Blanc, that means that the champagne was made just with the Chardonnay grapes, Whereas if it says Blanc de Noir, it's made with all Pinot Noir or Pinot Meunier grapes. So my favorite, the next one we're going to do here is Crémant, which is another French sparkling wine. But unlike champagne, it can be made in anywhere technically in France. So a lot of the time that's going to be in Alsace, Loire, Burgundy, so on and so forth. And really, outside of the fact that it is not done immediately in the Champagne region, the method is essentially the same. So you're still wind up with this like very bready, toasty, like little complicated sparkling wine, but they technically don't have to use just those 3 types of grapes too. So sometimes you might see like Aligot grapes or something along those lines. So then next, most people know what Prosecco is. That's going to be from Italy. And they use the Crémant method, which means that it's being done in kind of a more mass-produced kind of way, not bottle by bottle, which is why you're going to find Prosecco is a lot more affordable. It's going to be a lot like brighter and fruitier versus like complex and bready. It's very good. It's not going to give you that same effect that you can get when you are working with the traditional secondary fermentation. Cava is also done in the traditional method, so it's done a lot more like a Crémant or a champagne. And so it's like Spain's answer to a champagne. They use 3 different types of grapes typically. It's Macabeo, Xarel-lo, and Parellada. And the result is typically like pretty citrusy and maybe with a little bit of an earthy note to it, but you're gonna taste a difference between Cava and champagne. Lastly, most people have not heard of this kind, but there's also a sparkling wine called Franciacorta, which is also made in Italy. It's like what you would probably consider the champagne of Italy. It's made in Lombardy, and it is made with Chardonnay, Pinot Nero, and Pinot Bianco grapes. It uses the traditional method, and it's a little bit more complex and structured, and it's considered like the highest end Italian wine, or Italian sparkling choice. There are a couple other ones that I don't want to go into too much because they're just not as interesting. They don't have as much like history behind them. There's also other kinds of sparkling wine like Sekt, which is from Germany or Austria. It's usually Riesling based, and it's like going to be a little bit more crisp and fruity. There's also just like sparkling wine from the New World. So that's like California, South America, Australia, and so on. A lot of them will use the champagne methods, and so you might be able to recreate kind of a similar taste, but it's not going to be exactly the same for a lot of different reasons. And then there's also like the pet nat, the natural wine craze that everybody's going through. It's an older, much more rustic style of fermentation, but it also leaves kind of like a fizzy and cloudy and funkier kind of drink. So it's not going to be, it's technically a sparkling wine, but it's not going to be the same thing that you're typically thinking of when it comes to like a champagne or any of these other alternatives that we've been talking about just now. So then, as far as like what you want to pair champagne with, you want to look for things that are going to have like a very so in the sparkling wine world, champagne might be the star, but sparkling wine is a whole universe. And so what I really like about the fact that champagne's not the only option is that you can find different types of wine that are available to you that give you a similar result without having to spend, $60, $70, $80 minimum on a bottle. So my personal favorite of all of these is the Crémant. I think that it just replicates the qualities that make champagne so special. So you're typically like one of the best Crémants that I've had recently, actually. It's right here. And this is, let's see. This was, I think, $40, which if you're talking a special occasion, I think is pretty reasonable. At least for me it is. This is the one that's aligoté grapes, and it gives that very, like, what I like in a sparkling wine is that, like, bready kind of complicated flavor. I don't really like when my sparkling wine is too acidic or if it's too fruity. I just think that you miss some of the more interesting qualities when you focus on that. Thank you for joining me. If you have any questions or want to talk about any other kinds of sparkling wines that are out there, let me know in the comments. Thank you. Cheers. Bye.